Welcome to Collaborative Drug Discovery's scientific webinar on capturing mixtures, bringing informatics to the world of practical chemistry. Our industry has been using cheminformatics to support drug discovery for decades, leveraging formats for describing organic molecules such as Molfile, SMILES, and InChI. These are idolized concepts rather than a description of laboratory reality. It's rare that a substance can be accurately described with a single molecule. Almost every sample has an impurity level or is dissolved in solvent. Mixtures often combine certainty and uncertainty within the same description. Some components can be well-defined molecules with an accurately measured molar concentration, while others are estimated portions or amorphous adjuncts. The cheminformatics community has yet to select a standard format for describing mixtures in a machine-readable, standardized, and interoperable way, and most publications fall back on using a text description. Electronic lab notebooks and inventory databases are forced to choose between using text, proprietary formats, or ignoring mixture composition altogether. Today with our expert panelists, we will describe the work towards two new data structures, Mixfile and MInChI, and the ways in which we expect that mixtures-based informatics tools will affect all industries that intersect with chemistry. For those of you who are new to collaborative drug discovery, we are a software company driving innovation in scientific informatics since 2004. Our flagship product, CDD Vault, provides a cloud-based, secure solution for data management and is trusted globally by thousands of leading researchers. Founded by scientists, we strive for innovation and bring together experts every quarter for dynamic webinars. And with that, I am Samantha Jashonik, your moderator for today's webinar, and I am pleased to introduce today's expert panelists. I do encourage you to read more about their accomplishments on the CDD blog. We have Leah McEwen from Cornell University. Leah is the current chair-elect of the IUPAC Committee on Publication and Cheminformatic Data Standards. Chris Jakober from Johns Hopkins. Chris has worked on a number of chemical safety and regulatory efforts and recently served as a chemical hygiene officer at UC Davis. And Alex Clark from our own CDD. Alex has spent more than 15 years building software tools for all aspects of computer-aided drug design with a particular focus on data acquisition. If at any time during today's webinar you'd like to ask the panelists a question, feel free to use Zoom's built-in Q&A panel. We'll be sure to save time at the end to answer any of your questions. So let's begin with a broad question then, panelists. Today's webinar is all about chemical representation, and you hear a lot of buzzwords lately around machine readability. Can you touch on what machine readability is and why it's important in the field of cheminformatics?
All right, so machine readability is basically the art of describing a fact to a computer that takes everything completely literally and has no context. So that's quite distinct from the traditional scientific communication styles, which assume that the other person is a human who understands the domain pretty well and can look up references and figure out the context. So it takes a bit of a mind switch, but there is so much that you can do once computers can get involved in this business.
So could you briefly comment on what are some of the current standards in place to make compound data more interoperable? And what has been the greatest focal point so far? Is it compounds? Is it reactions?
Yeah, you touched on those in the intro. So the compounds have really been the main focus for standardization in large quantities of data. So Molfiles for sketches is the main one. Things like InChI and SMILES are both line notations. InChI is a good canonical representation, which makes it a great database indexer. Things like CAS numbers are actually references to databases, but you've probably run into those many times. They're very popular. But when it comes to things like reactions, there are still options, but less to choose from. In mixtures, there's really not a lot going on.
And I would just add to that molecules are usually described conceptually in many of these notations and formats. This is the way we design our chemical space, thinking about single compounds. And this is the way we organize our chemical data. But there really isn't a lot that focuses on mixed substances, and mixtures really are more functional in the real world, kind of like cooking when you're combining things, solutions, alloys. No compound is pure, as Samantha said in the introduction. So there really isn't a lot available.
Well, and I think historically people have been able to use internal identifiers in fairly siloed systems with pretty much little or no concern for any external use cases. This internal mindset and approach met their particular needs. And as such, there's, little to no standardization and little, if any, thought was given to interoperability.
Before we go any further, we should probably define what a mixture is, or how would you define a mixture?
That's a fairly loaded question. I mean, in its simplest terms, you would say that a mixture is two or more things mixed together in some ratio. But it's a huge spectrum of things that are mixtures, and it's something that the IUPAC-InChI mixtures working group really struggled with to get an operable definition given how diverse that spectrum is as it relates to mixtures.
Yeah,
So-
just what Leah was saying earlier. I mean, a compound description is really a high concept of some abstract idea, whereas the mixture is the reality. It's the thing at the bench that you have in actual space.
So as Chris mentioned, the MInChI project group within IUPAC was formed to start thinking about how to describe mixtures in a machine-readable, interoperable way. On the screen now, you can see the members of that project team. It's been a great group. The three of us are from that team. And this is a great opportunity for us to be able to think out loud a little bit about this project. Thank you for that. And thinking about this from an informational perspective, we're trying to figure out what do we know about mixtures and what's really critical to try to notate, for the function of communicating machine to machine, system to system. So on the screen here, you can kind of see this is what we have to work with. Most mixtures, as they're described now in catalogs or in research protocols, are, consist of the components and then some information maybe about the ratio between them, and maybe a few other pieces of information. But it's very inconsistent, and there really isn't. It's not definitely not machine readable. So thinking about mixtures, I think we're really coming from the project's perspective, we're really coming from a design perspective. So mixtures are really designed as recipes towards some functional property, as in a formulation, or some function they need to perform in a laboratory, as in a solution, or even a cleaning product or agent. So we're coming from that perspective. What's in the recipe that you really need to know to communicate from system to system?
And these efforts are really driven out of necessity, as has been articulated already. In many cases, if not nearly all cases, when you use materials, it's almost always a mixture of things. Rarely ever is it a single molecule or compound, and that's really kind of the motivation.
So then why has mixture standardization really lagged behind other formats for pure compounds, and why is it just now maybe gaining momentum?
The simple explanation really is demand. So I think we all know that pharmaceutical industry aids associated with them. For other aspects, this format is considered to be a bit more of a nice to have. It just hasn't risen to the level where someone has really tried to push it. Basically, we're ready to do mixtures now, and quite possibly because we're really entering the age of data science. I mean, every other field has done some pretty amazing things just by collecting large amounts of data and modeling and learning from it. So we're at the point where we're leaving no stone unturned, if you like. And mixture representation is actually pretty low-hanging fruit. It's not terribly complicated, and so the things that we can do with data, we think that's going to be pretty cool.
Well, I think historical approaches with an internal mindset met most people's needs. And as Alex indicated, it's the data age and external use cases that are really now serving as a driver for change.
Yeah, and there are a lot of internal workarounds that they get the job done, and people are pretty happy with them. But there really hasn't been an effort to take all of these and say, okay, let's all get on the same page so we can share data and make use of it collectively.
I think, as Alex mentioned, you know, a lot of the work in informatics and in communicating information about chemicals in machine-readable ways been around drug discovery, you know, and design of small molecules and individual compounds. But when you get into the mixtures space, it's really, really very broad. You know, mixtures are used all across different disciplines, all across different types of labs, all for different functions in those labs, outside of the labs, consumer products, you know, petroleum. It is just such a broad world out there. I think it's almost been, you know, too hard to conceive of how you would even tackle that. You know, there are definitely provisions in some of those formats that were mentioned earlier for notating mixed substances, but they really haven't been very consistently or broadly used. So this is an opportunity for us to kind of work a little bit more leveraging standards that exist and putting them together in a way that can be used across different use cases and different, you know, different styles of mixtures, you might say, system to system.
Yeah, and you know, as it relates to, say, the example of pharmaceutical industry, you have the active ingredients versus these inert ingredients, and all of these things have an impact, though, on efficacy, absorption, bioavailability, all these different aspects in terms of how the thing performs. And as you can see here, the active ingredient is just one of many things in this actual material that you're either going to take orally for whatever outcome this pharmaceutical drug was designed for, or to brush your teeth, for instance.
So what exactly do we mean when we say a standardized representation of mixtures, and how does that fit in with current chemistry standards?
Yeah, the definition of a mixture, Chris was introducing it before. From a pragmatic point of view, we say that there has to be at least one thing in there that we would be comfortable describing with chemical iconography, if you like. And there has to be some value in adding additional information like concentration, purity, and so on. And so what you see on the screen here is a kind of a medium complicated chemical reagent that you would find at the bench quite often. There's one main active ingredient, and that would normally be the thing that would be listed in a catalog, for example, the lithium diisopropylamide. And that's measured precisely. The concentration is well known, it's in there. And it's mixed with a ratio of solvents. One of the solvents is more complicated because it's mixed up with a bunch of variety of hydrocarbons, each of which is specified fairly vaguely. So we just want to be able to capture essentially all of the information that you know about this mixture of chemical substances. And sometimes you don't even know all of the things that are in there. And sometimes the amounts of things are vague or unknown entirely.
So as Alex was saying, we've started with what we can say, what we can know about what's in a mixture. So the components are something that we know we may know not all of them, but we know some of them that are of interest to us. And so we can use InChI in many cases for those if they're explicitly described. And this allows us to leverage that standard InChI technology so that people can compare ingredients maybe between different mixtures, or they can link data that they have about their mixture to databases that use InChI to organize data around single compounds, so they can link data sources in that way. And once we have a series of InChIs notated together to indicate components that we're aware of in a mixture, we can start describing additional pieces of information. So Alex just mentioned concentration, and we have a notation for that. And we're also considering possible other relationships between components, like the order in which they're measured. In the previous slide, Alex had mentioned that one of the solvents is contains several components within it, so you can kind of describe that nesting within a mixture. It's almost like, it's almost Boolean-like in a sense of what you can do.
Yeah, in each of the components, there are usually quite a lot of things that we could say about if we really wanted to, but some of them are more fundamental than others. So ideally, there should be some indication of what the molecular component is, and maybe that's a simple structure, or maybe it might just be a formula, or whatever it is that you know about the component should be in there. And concentration is the other main one. So as much information as you have about how much of it there is. And that can be specific or vague or non-existent. And then there's a whole lot of other metadata which might be considered more optional, like various kinds of references and identifiers and synonyms and so on.
So, oh, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, as you can see here, you know, the MInChI is not intended to be human decipherable, right? It's intended to be machine readable, and thus the necessity in many instances for standardization, such that two different machines interpret the string of information the same way.
I was just going to add that that idea behind the MInChI aspect is not to be a comprehensive description of a mixture, because you know, there's so much variety in mixtures, and then the different use cases for mixtures and this information could vary so much. So in the spirit of interoperability, trying to focus in on what can be said distinctly and explicitly and consistently across different systems and different use cases. And I think the Mixfile that Alex will be speaking about later in the webinar, you know, is a broader format that leverages the core aspects of the MInChI.
I think it's a good time to take a break and have our first poll. For that, we'll hand the mic over to our question master, Charlie.
All right, everyone. I have just launched a poll, and we would certainly appreciate our attendees in the audience to respond here. As we ask, how do you currently report mixtures in your industry? So with your mouse, if you could go ahead and click on the option that best describes how you're currently reporting your mixtures, that would be most appreciated. Getting some great responses rolling in, and we'll give everyone a few more seconds here to make their responses in the poll. All right, we seem to have reached a fairly steady state, so I will end the polling in 3, 2, 1. Perfect. I will share results here. And as we can see now, you know, it's to me seems to be fairly even, but a 36% of the audience is currently sharing or reporting mixtures using a text-based format that includes active ingredient and primary solvent details. So I don't know if any of our panelists are surprised by this or have any comments on this, you know, being the winner, or really it's a pretty tight race between those three there in the middle.
More public standards than I would have expected. This is good.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I was a little surprised at that amount.
Yeah, on the other hand, though, they're probably being applied quite differently. And then two of those three heavy hitters there are not necessarily very machine processable. So definitely we have a lot of work to do in this area. That's the good news.
Thanks, everyone. All right, I will clear these results and let you resume your regularly scheduled webinar.
Based on the results, it seems like people are capturing something about their mixtures, or they're trying to. So can you enlighten us as to what sort of comparisons or insights unambiguous capture of mixture data will allow, and what industries will be most pertinent?
Well, one thing is, as soon as you start to try to count how much you have of a thing, if you have too many ways to describe the same thing, you start to get under aggregation. And I saw this highly frequently in like this example here of an inventory for a higher ed facility, building, institution. You have many things here that are exactly the same, but you've got a multitude of ways in which they're being described. So when you try to think about reporting how much hazardous material you have, if you have a bunch of different ways that you're describing the same thing, you're underreporting and underestimating your risk as it relates to how you're assessing compliance with, say, fire code, or how you're going to build a new building or research laboratory if you don't know truly how much you need to house within that structure. And that plays downstream as well as you relate to the people that want to use that information. You know, your emergency responders or community right to know. You need to be able to count the same thing and have some confidence that you really are capturing all of that thing.
Yeah, I mean, these value propositions apply to any kind of inventory management, really broadly defined, and that's often starts with the vendor. So just being able to archive these mixtures effectively and search them and find duplicates and make absolutely sure you know what's in there make sure it's filled out as completely as it needs to be. And so if we think of that as kind of a flow between the people who created the mixture and sold it to you, if that information comes with this transfer, it goes into your internal inventory management system. You get the same ability to organize and find and so on. And then again, when you actually start to use these things, they go into your electronic lab notebook. And so the information is complete, and it stays there for posterity. And if we have good standards and they're always going to be interpretable by software, we really don't lose any information from really the beginning to the end of the experiment, and all the way through to publication eventually.
Yeah, and as both Alex and Chris mentioned, you know, consistent description can help you do things all along your pipeline, you know, from purchasing from vendors into your own internal design and work, and then out into the regulatory end of it. And really, without that consistent description of mixtures and mixed substances and components together that have a relationship, you know, there really is no way to understand that information as it goes down that pipeline and out into the, you know, into the real world. And, you know, you could even think of downstream users further on, you know, particularly like consumers, for example, and right to know. You could also think about how this information could help you optimize your process, you know, within your own research core. You know, you're always adjusting your solvent concentration, so you can kind of track those experiments over time and optimize if you're able to describe this information more consistently.
Can you provide a real life example maybe of where failure to be interoperable caused downstream complications?
Something that immediately would come to mind would be a process or reaction where you have a constituent that's got multiple isomeric forms. And, you know, if somebody doesn't describe with sufficient detail which particular isomer they used, someone else downstream tries to replicate that reaction or process, and they select the wrong one, you can have a huge impact, you know, on the time of that person downstream, the efficacy of the outcome, you know, the stability of the products and or the process, and potentially even the hazard of the material or process that they're creating by this misinterpretation. And I think this becomes even more important given that research is becoming consistently more interdisciplinary, and so removing the ambiguity has tremendous value.
Is there a certain community that might benefit the most from standardized mixture representation?
I think any community that relies on institutional knowledge is going to benefit greatly from this standard in particular, and that's a general statement too. Going back to my lab days as a bench chemist, we had our own systems for describing the materials that we used and what we did with them, and it worked pretty well, but there was always an onboarding time. And also whenever somebody left the group, they would always take a little bit of knowledge with them. And so if information is being kept in these standardized formats that are pretty complete, it kind of, you can put it somewhere where it lasts forever. You don't have to worry too much about losing it. And also you can start to leverage software for getting people up to speed so they know what's going on.
Yeah, I could see a huge value for, you know, your synthetic laboratories in higher education, you know, being able to accurately describe the composition of something as opposed to just some combination of syntax of the synthetic chemist initials and the notebook number and the page number, such that somebody down the line knows exactly what that material is when it comes time to, say, clean out a lab or dispose of materials. You know, knowing what the composition of that material is and reducing the number of unknowns can significantly reduce the cost of trying to dispose of materials when labs turn over in higher ed.
Point on that, yeah. You know, on the flip side, when, you know, as artificial intelligence and machine learning is becoming more incorporated into research design, you know, the more you can incorporate standard machine accessible ways of describing your process, you know, the more you can play the parameters, you might say. You know, and the way that MInChI is structured, it, you know, can play quite nice with InChI, you know, and with other formats. You can easily parse apart the information and plug it around. So there's a lot of opportunity.
How does the design world or formulations impact how we think of mixtures and the data standards needed around them?
Well, as we were discussing earlier, there's been a lot of internal strategies that organizations have used. I mean, absolutely, it's not a new thing to be able to keep track of what's happening in your process design or in your formulations, but everybody's done their own thing. And we don't really have an industry-wide concept of what a mixture is, or even a mixed substance, and how we need to document that for a variety of purposes. So there's a lot of software that everyone's using at different points in their process, and all of the software has become very customized, and it doesn't even really allow the flow, consistent flow of information, often even about single compounds, much less, mixed substances like this. So I think being able to pull together disparate data sources that relate to compounds and labs and properties and all of this information together will be really important. And being able to also then, kind of plug along all of your steps in your process, as Alex was saying earlier, all the way from the vendor all the way out to publishing your paper and downstream use.
Yeah, and I think you need to design something that doesn't force people to be overly descriptive. The flexibility that you allow them will hopefully promote faster and easier adoption of the structure.
Yeah, just double down on that. The format has to be comfortable with missing information as well as information that's present. You don't want to force people to create information that they don't already actually have.
That's a great point. How is standardization of mixtures relevant for consumers outside of the laboratory? Can they benefit from the standardization at all?
Sure. I would say, often in marketing, you hear a manufacturer make a claim about a product in relation to a competitor's product. But what if after closer evaluation and the composition of those two things, they're, nearly identical? And so do you draw into question that? Is it an actual reality that the one product behaves better, or is it just solely marketing?
Yeah. I mean, of course, people have the right to know what they're buying. And if you've ever looked at labels on consumer products, I'm sure you've been fairly underwhelmed by the information that you can get out of it. So if you just imagine that if there was always a way to look up the information in some standardized form that was as understandable by computers, you could not only have that information in a consistent way, but you can also leverage software to help tell you what these things really are and why it matters that they're in the thing you just walked out of the shop with.
And slightly upstream from that, all the agencies that are trying to manage this data reporting from the industry out to the consumers, it's just a nightmare of data often, to manage those processes. But thinking about the data science environment right now, the more data that we know about our chemicals and can get out into the world, that facilitates chemistry worldwide and across disciplines. Chemistry is the central science, and chemicals are used in all wet labs, I always like to think. So this is it's really important to network well beyond our own individual use cases or even the use cases of our organizations.
That's a good lead into sort of my next question, which is, most common data structures are around single compounds. We've heard that, and it's not really how scientists operate on the day-to-day. But how would introducing more inclusive standards affect the realm of cheminformatics and modeling then?
Yeah, I mean, some of the mainstream workflows wouldn't change particularly much. Like, for example, gathering structure activity data and building predictive models. But one thing that might be quite significantly affected there is the ability to detect false positives. So if you have an impurity or a solvent, say, that's responsible for activity or lack thereof, having that mixture information could give you the key that you need to make that a lot better. I think from a direct influence point of view, the mixtures data might affect some less routine modeling exercises, like, for example, trying to predict the rates of reactions or aggregate properties of materials that are several different components mixed together, trying to figure out what happens when you have more or less of one, or change one and not the other, and so on. So yeah, the possibilities are endless, of course. I mean, once we have a lot of data, we make that available to people. It'll be exciting to find out what they actually do with it.
Great. So let's take another break for our final poll to the audience. Charlie, you want to take it away?
Absolutely. All right, audience. I have launched a second poll for you attendees here. And if you wouldn't mind, please let us know, where would mixtures standards like MInChI have the greatest impact on you and your company? Oh goodness, they are racing to answer this question. Have different levels here: scientist level, informatics level, inventory, transport and safety, or regulatory level. Tell us your greatest area of impact here. All right, well, we seem to have a steady state and we've got a very clear winner, so I will end this polling in 3, 2, 1. All right. Here you go, panelists. 52% think that the informatics level will be impacted the greatest by these mixtures standards. Any thoughts or comments, or are you surprised by this clear winner?
I'm pleased.
Yeah, I mean, it's the scientific possibilities are always a nice driver. I think many of the other things are much more about how we do our work well and safely, and how we communicate, which seems like it just should be normal business. But that, I don't think that diminishes their importance. It's just less intriguing.
Yeah, looking forward to improving those models. That sounds good.
We also might have a bias of audience members who are all scientists or data scientists on the webinar.
I think it's really
We'll pretend it's representative.
All right, perfect. All right, everyone, I'll clear these results and you can resume your webinar.
So I just want to give the audience a final reminder that you can submit your questions in the Q&A panel. We've had a couple rolling in, so we're curious to see what other questions you come up with. Okay, so let's get back to it. What is the intersection between mixtures and reactions?
So you can think about this in a very basic, simple way, right? I mean, every time you run a reaction, you're mixing things together in your reaction vessel for the purpose of them interacting. So in a sense, reactions are mixtures. And then also, you know, when you mix things together, even in a solution, there's going to be maybe something that happens over time in the bottle. Within the MInChI project, we're kind of focusing on the snapshot in time, what your recipe is for what went into the bottle initially, and not what happens there. So that's kind of how we're distinguishing it a little bit. But the basic concept of multiple components that have some relationship to each other that you want to try to document is part of where we're going with this. And then there is an existing, and actually it's the first version is launched, notation available for reaction InChIs called RINCHI. And the structure of RINCHI was an inspiration for the structure of the MInChI notation as well, because of that similarity in type of data that you're including in those.
Yeah, and just to re-up on that, I mean, the underlying data structures are very similar, which is why they're often mentioned in the same sentence. But of course, a reaction is something that's actually happening. It's a verb, whereas a mixture is a statement of something that it is at this point in time. So it's a noun, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, again, you know, and also, even though reactions are something that you're running in your lab, again, when we think about them informationally, and particularly when we're designing, you know, we think about reactions conceptually as well, really actually transformations, right? About from you know, back to that level of the single molecules and what we're trying to do with those on a design level. Mixtures are much more about designing things that you're going to use, like, you know, in the context of your laboratory, that real world aspect. So there are some distinctions there as well.
Well, and I would potentially argue that, the ability to describe reactions in a machine readable and a machine friendly format almost created the necessity for the ability to describe mixtures in a similar machine friendly or machine readable format, because in most instances, the outcome of a reaction is going to be some mixture of products. Rarely do you get 100% yield of a singular thing.
What software or tools currently exist for capturing mixture data? It's the big question, right?
Well, as we were discussing earlier, there are several different formats for describing single molecules, particularly small molecules, for various purposes. And several of those do have options for fields and where you could describe multiple components together. But as I mentioned before, not very well consistently used, and very few software options are available for translating the data that you have, whether it's that text-based description that we've been looking at all through the webinar, or multiple compounds all driven out, going from there into, a consistent format for mixture. So, so there actually are very few. In fact, actually, that's one of the drivers of the MInChI project, is to enable a fairly straightforward, easy to use format for software providers to make this functionality available.
Yeah, clearly there's a huge use case here for the electronic lab notebook environment, but that's not being met at the present time.
Yeah, and amongst the community that we've interacted with, basically using Excel to describe mixtures would be considered relatively sophisticated. So that certainly indicates that there's plenty of room for improvement. And so speaking of room for improvements, I'm just going to quickly talk about some of the stuff that we've been doing at CDD in collaboration with the IUPAC group. And so we decided to try to tackle this project with some grant funding support that we were lucky to get from the NIH. And so starting out, we have this problem with a significant lack of data. So we decided to put together a very straightforward format that allows us to capture the information that people are acquiring in the real world, to make this a fairly inclusive format. And we're calling this the Mixfile format. So we think of it as kind of like the ubiquitous Molfile, except it's for mixtures instead. And so what you see on the screen there is our open source editor, and there's a GitHub link on the left there. And the main panel lets you edit the tree structure of these mixtures. That's one of the same compounds mixtures we showed on the slide earlier. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that we also have functionality in there for editing the metadata about components. So that includes the fundamental concepts like the actual structure and quantity, but also things like names, synonyms, references, and so on. So because we're kind of starting from scratch, and that there's not a lot of structured information out there, because there isn't really much software or need to create this stuff. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that we've made some inroads in collecting content. So there is a lot of information that's written out in a short mnemonic form, kind of like labels, where scientist to scientist communication is fairly effective, and sorts of things you'll see in catalogs. And so we put in quite a bit of work to interpret these things using natural language techniques and extracting out this very, very highly distilled content and building it out into a fully described mixture definition. And once we have all of this information in a very straightforward, well-defined format, we can start to do interesting things like, obviously, queries on those structures there. That's going to work right away, and we have concentration information and so on. And so we're really pushing this idea of getting this unformatted, non-machine readable information quickly and easily into a format that we can do pretty much anything that we could imagine with. So if you go to the next slide, I'll just show you some evidence that we really have been working hand in hand with the IUPAC MInChI group. And so we've been making sure that the formats we're using for our software is very much analogous to this mixtures MInChI that Leah has been describing. And we actually have a proof of concept built right into our tools. So if you describe a mixture by sketching it out or importing text content, you can create this MInChI notation. And this boiled down form has certain canonical properties. So it's much more much more rigorously defined. And so if you can put that in a database and do comparison operations very simply, whereas the format that we are dealing with, this Mixfile format, is intended to capture everything that you know about it without worrying too much about the actual comparison that's pushed to a later step. Fortunately, we've just very recently found out that we do have the funding to continue this project, and we're very excited about that because it means that we can, we've already built some neat stuff, but it's prototype form, but so we can actually go deep and really pursue this until the end. So that's great.
So then once we have the software completely built up, or even just the standard in place, how long does it take for the standard to be adopted?
So as you can see, in this case, it's been a great opportunity for us to work with CDD, to kind of put it in practice in a system, to see how well it plays and what you can do with it, and how interesting the use case is. And that we still have a lot of things that can be done with that. So it's really great to hear that more can be done. But some of the data that's been collected, as Alex mentioned, there was that GitHub link on the previous slide here. There's a DOI link on this slide to a paper that was published in Journal of Cheminformatics describing both MInChI and Mixfile a little bit further. So these notations, the notation for MInChI is described now, and it's not that complicated. It's a canonicalization. There's some basic rules around concentration. So we're still definitely at that proof of concept stage. We haven't officially formalized the notation, and we haven't, made an official version of the code base yet. But it's available now, I think, for people to, I would encourage you to take a look, and you could start incorporating it. We do definitely hope to provide a reference implementation of the code in conjunction with the reaction InChI code that I mentioned before. So that work is going to be starting in the new year.
Yeah, I mean, this standardization effort is interesting because we're sort of building all of the bricks at the same time. So we're putting forward two formats that have their distinct value proposition, and also building software, and also starting to gather together data. A lot of standardization processes will piggyback on something that's much more advanced, but we hope that we can build this pretty quickly because we have a lot of interest from the community, and we're definitely committed.
What are some of the benefits or use cases to different types of stakeholders?
I would again focus on this idea of starting with the vendors and going down through the steps. So this idea that you can find whatever it is that you need online and just keep that data throughout your entire workflow. And so that means you don't ever actually have to go to the trouble of describing these mixtures. And so if you just grab them from your internal inventory or wherever you found them online, that data just follows you around. And so we foresee a lot of ways to make things just so much easier. Preparing documents is painful, and using them is fraught with peril if they're not machine readable in any useful way. So yeah, we were just trying to look at economies of scale, and once people start using these formats a lot more, they become much more ubiquitous. Everything just gets easier, as well as working better.
I would say that software development community is another high win for incorporating this type of work, and getting this functionality into the pipeline all the way through. Again, being able to pull that vendor data and incorporate it into your LIMS and ELN systems all the way down the pipeline, and that will open up this functionality for scientists as well as informaticians. So I think that'd be a great benefit.
And I could even see potentially further down the line, as it becomes more consistently adopted to describe data sets in a structured format, the folks that are looking at, say, environmental fate and transport may now have more data sets at their disposal because they know the structure, they can deal with it easier and whatnot, and that may ultimately improve the models as far as the outcomes and the accuracies for ultimate fate and transport in our ecosystems.
Thank you, panelists. And we've had some really interesting discussions so far, and I don't want to cut it short, but we do have a number of questions rolling in. So I want to make sure that we address them. Charlie's been watching those questions, and one last time, Charlie, take it away. And what do you have for us?
All right, thank you. So all of the panelists at some point today have mentioned how MInChI and the description of mixtures may relate and be expandable into the world of formulation. So we had a question specific to that. One definition of a formulation is that it is a mixture where the components have a role. They're there for a reason. Can this reason be modeled as well in some standard representations, such as the MInChI?
We've definitely discussed that possibility within the MInChI working team, you know, and conceivably with the kind of linear layered approach of the MInChI form, which reflects the original layered approach of the InChI. You can add layers, you know, and then the challenge becomes what kind of approach we want to use for consistently describing roles. You know, so if we can come around some, you know, distinct roles and a way to notate those in some form, you know, that kind of bookkeeping is fairly straightforward. It's trying to understand what you'd want to do with that information once you get it back out. Do you have any more thoughts on that, Alex or Chris?
Yeah, and that plays into the separation that we've worked out between this Mixfile representation, which is open-ended. It kind of invites you to add information that as you see fit. So adding a role concept of your own would be very straightforward with that. And we make this distinction between fundamental concepts and things that you consider to be useful, and they may or may not even be general. So you could have something completely secondary but specific, or secondary but standardized. And the mixtures InChI part is more tailored towards the fundamental concepts, because we're trying to boil it down to just the raw information you need for archival purposes. So
and interoperability, right?
Yes, it's a long-winded way of saying yes.
Yeah, and I think they've highlighted that, you know, the goal here of the group is to still provide flexibility such that we enhance adoption. And so if that's something that is likely to encourage its use, then it's absolutely something that should be considered and if at all possible, pursued.
Perfect. All right, thanks everyone. So I guess maybe backing up and going a little bit broader, but very similar to the same concept. You mentioned that, you know, that the basic fundamental aspects and versus, you know, the roles of components in a formulation. Just how will you decide, or is the world going to decide in these standards, what is data versus metadata for these mixtures? Because it seems to be there's going to be maybe some distinction there.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to divide those two words between each other, but I would say fundamental and non-fundamental. I think we've covered our thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's one way of thinking about it. I think this is really a description, right? I mean, MInChI is a type of description. So in that sense, it's a metadata. The measured data, if you're thinking about data that way, is living in different data stores, and the ability of the MInChI to help us go link between those data stores, is the value here. The concentration is included because it's about the relationship between the components that are in the mixtures. But that concentration is where we're drawing that from. Again, like I said, the recipe. This is how this mixture was intended. It's not an actual measured ratio, measured concentration of any one mixture in any one bottle. That's your local data. I don't know if that helps or not. Chris, did you have any thoughts, given how much data and metadata you've had to do in the inventory world?
Yeah, I agree. You know, I think Leah just articulated my primary goal in all this is just to create the mechanism by which you can talk between systems, and the metadata is kind of, a secondary element of that, and it was never the intention per se of the MInChI.
Excellent, thank you. So one more question about the MInChI specifically and exactly what's described in those, and this, may be getting into, too many details that we just don't have the time to cover completely. But can you possibly reiterate the descriptors of the mixtures that will be described, like ratios, ranges, states of the matter, melting point, boiling point, the form, whether it's an emulsion, solid, a solution, and kind of information like that? Or can we dip a little bit into those details right now, or maybe we can take that one offline and I can connect to the audience member, to the panelist, and have a nice discussion on that as well.
I think we can do it. We covered ratio and range well. The other ones, various states, properties, boiling points, etc. Those fit nicely into the Mixfile format in a very convenient way. Also because both Mixfile and the mixtures InChI have a hierarchical format, you can describe these, you can insert these properties in intermediate locations. So maybe at the root, if you wanted a boiling point for the mixture in general, you would insert that at the very top. But if also you wanted to record specific properties for individual components, as in what they would be if they weren't in the mixture, you can record that as well. So the position is relevant. Maybe Leah, you can drill down on some of the details there in the MInChI.
Yeah, so you know, definitely this is where we're in a sort of a phase one idea around the MInChI itself, that linear string in terms of what's captured in there. So definitely state of matter has definitely come up, less so maybe the other properties. Again, those live often in data stores that people are navigating between. You know, the form of InChI and MInChI was always designed to be extensible, and thinking about what's logical at the standard level, you know, so that everybody worldwide can be using this versus what you need locally is another consideration in this equation. But ultimately, both MInChI and then the systems you're using it in, you know, have that extensibility in terms of adding, you know, associating more information and attributes with that core information. So, I mean, we've you know, the group has really kind of drawn a line around this initial scope of ratio and range, as Alex mentioned, you know, for the purpose of getting it out into the world and getting it going and trying it out in the CDD software, or if there's other groups that are interested in implementing it. And once we have that, I think we can move into considering other aspects of information that might be transferable types of information to include in a MInChI string.
Yeah, I would just add that I think, you know, in kind of this initial effort, we'll be very happy just to represent composition, and then we can worry about behavior and other elements later down the road.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, guys. I think we will wrap up the Q&A session at this point and have a few more minutes for our farewell and an exciting announcement about a webinar coming up very soon.
Thank you, Charlie. Before I get sort of a take-home message from our panelists, I do want to let everybody know that we will have a practical demonstration of CDD Vault hosted with our own Bobby Thorne Thursday, January 9th at 12 Eastern. So be sure to tune in for that and keep your eyes open on your email for more details. As a final closing to the webinar, could each panelist please give me about 1 or 2 sentences that you really want to resonate with the audience, your take-home message from today? We'll start with Alex.
All right. Well, I'd say basically machine readability is your friend. We do tend to talk quite a bit about what all of the cool things that would happen if everybody put in a little bit of extra time and made their information machine readable. But really in the greater scheme of things, it is not actually more trouble once we start to get used to using these formats and we improve our software and we make existing databases more readily available. So ultimately, as I was saying earlier, it's going to get easier to bring in your data, and you're going to get to do a lot more interesting things with it. So definitely take the time to get into it, because it's going to pay off a lot.
You're up, Leah.
I will leave you with a quote from one of the students I work with here at Cornell on data management. And she says, "Don't trust your future self, document your data now." So, you know, notating your data in a way where even yourself can come back when you need to and understand what you did, you know, and definitely for others, and including machines and those others that will want to use your data. Do it now, do it often.
Wise words.
All right, bring us home, Chris.
Well, and you know, I've touched on the interdisciplinary nature of modern research, and so I would just say, you know, think about consciously avoiding tunnel vision with respect to your task and your research and whatnot, because there are others down the road that probably have great uses for your information, but that information needs to be conveyed accurately and machine friendly for the future.
Great. Well, thank you again, panelists, for your time and great discussion. Audience, for your great questions. If you have any questions for CDD, there's some contact information on the screen, and we look forward to collaborating. Happy holidays.
Thank you very much. Happy holidays.
Take care, everybody.
See you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. I will end the meeting now. Have a great one.